Evelyn hid a recorder in her husband Richard's car, expecting to confirm her suspicions of infidelity. Instead, she heard him and his mistress plotting to frame her for fraud, seize her company's shares, and ensure she was permanently out of the way. Shock turned quickly into strategy as she realized her marriage had become a calculated conspiracy against her. Rather than confront him, Evelyn chose to play along, quietly preparing to destroy the very trap they set for her. Welcome to True Love Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us. It means the world to us. Also share this video. Now let's go into the story. Evelyn Hart had always trusted her instincts. Growing up in a tight-knit Black family that prized discernment as much as dignity, she learned early that survival wasn't just about strength. It was about awareness. Her grandmother used to say, "When something feels off, baby, it usually is." Lately, everything felt off. Her husband, Richard Hart, had become a stranger in small, almost invisible ways. Not dramatic enough to accuse. Not obvious enough to confront. Just different. Richard used to kiss her forehead before leaving for work. Now he checked his phone first. He used to talk freely about board meetings and contracts over dinner. Now his answers were clipped, strategic, rehearsed. He guarded his screen like it held state secrets. And the laughter, his full-bodied, deep laugh that once filled their home, had become rare and forced. Their company, Hart Global Enterprises, wasn't just a business. It was legacy. Evelyn had inherited the initial capital from her father, a self-made Black entrepreneur who built wealth from nothing but grit and discipline. She had expanded it, multiplied it, turned it into a powerhouse investment firm that quietly funded tech startups, real estate developments, and minority-owned businesses nationwide. Richard had married into brilliance, and lately he had been acting like he owned it. The first crack came when Evelyn noticed a faint scent in Richard's car. Not hers. Not something subtle enough to dismiss. It was floral, expensive, intentional. She said nothing. She simply inhaled once more and closed the passenger door gently. The second crack was digital. One evening while reviewing companies scheduling on their shared tablet, a notification briefly flashed before disappearing. Meeting, 7:30 p.m. M. Just an initial. Evelyn stared at the blank screen afterward, her reflection staring back at her, calm, composed, calculating. She didn't ask about it. Instead, she began watching. Richard started working late twice a week. He claimed investor dinners, emergency consultations, networking obligations. Yet his suits came home without the scent of steakhouse smoke or whiskey. Instead, there was that same floral whisper. Then came the shift in finances. Evelyn handled high-level strategic investments. Richard oversaw operational accounts. It was a structure built on trust. But during a quarterly review, she noticed something subtle. Minor reallocation drafts that had been started but not completed. Files opened under her credentials, then closed. That was when suspicion hardened into certainty. Richard wasn't just distracted. He was maneuvering. Evelyn didn't act out of rage. She acted out of precision. One quiet Wednesday afternoon, after Richard left for a client strategy session, Evelyn stood in their garage holding a small digital recorder in her hand. It was sleek, black, unassuming. Her heart wasn't racing. It was steady. She opened the driver's side door and slid her hand beneath the seat, fastening the device securely where it couldn't be seen unless someone was deliberately searching. For a moment, she paused. This was a line. Once crossed, there would be no going back to innocent assumptions. No pretending she didn't know. She closed the door gently. 2 days later, Evelyn sat alone in her private study. Mahogany shelves lined the walls, filled with business journals, framed awards, and a photograph of her late father shaking her hand the day she became CEO. The recorder lay on her desk. She pressed play. At first, there was nothing but the hum of the engine, the rhythmic click of the turn signal, Richard clearing his throat. Then, a woman's voice. Smooth, confident, black, young but not naive. Are you sure she hasn't noticed anything? Evelyn's fingers froze on the edge of the desk. Richard chuckled softly. A sound she hadn't heard at home in months. Evelyn trusts me. She's too focused on expansion to see what's happening right under her nose. The woman laughed, a low, intimate sound. Evelyn felt the air leave her lungs slowly, but she remained still. Then came the words that shattered the illusion of mere infidelity. Once she signs off on the restructuring, it's done, Richard continued. Her shares automatically convert under the new holding agreement. And if she doesn't? The woman asked. A pause. Richard's voice dropped, cold, calculating. She won't have a choice. By then, the financial discrepancies will point straight to her. Fraud. Mismanagement. Whatever sticks. Silence filled the room. Then the woman spoke again, more serious now. And after that, Richard didn't hesitate. Once she's out of the way, everything transfers to me. The company. The estate. All of it. Evelyn's pulse thundered in her ears. But it was the next line that made her blood run cold. I've already updated the insurance policy, Richard added casually. Just in case. The woman inhaled sharply. Richard, that's extreme. It's necessary. Evelyn stopped the recording. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She stared at nothing, replaying the conversation in her mind. Every inflection. Every calculated word. This wasn't a man in love with someone else. This was a man engineering her destruction. She pressed play again, forced herself to listen twice more. No tears fell. Not because it didn't hurt, but because shock had turned her sorrow into something sharper. Strategic. Richard had underestimated her. He saw her as brilliant in business, but blinded by love. What he didn't realize was that Evelyn Hart had built empires in rooms where men doubted her intelligence. She had negotiated contracts with executives who assumed she was an assistant. She had survived rooms where her presence alone was questioned. She knew how to play long games. And now she had evidence. She leaned back slowly in her chair. Her marriage wasn't cracking. It had been weaponized. And if Richard thought she was the unsuspecting wife in his story, he had forgotten who funded the empire. Evelyn picked up her phone and made one quiet call. Marcus, she said calmly when her attorney answered. I need you to clear your schedule. We're going to war. And this time, she would be ready. Evelyn did not confront Richard. She perfected her performance. The morning after hearing the recording, she rose before him, prepared his favorite breakfast, cheese grits, turkey bacon, fresh fruit, and greeted him with a softness so convincing it unsettled even her. Richard studied her for a flicker of suspicion, but she offered none. If anything, she seemed lighter, attentive, affectionate. It was the first move in a game he didn't know had two players. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. The grief was there, yes, but it had hardened into discipline. Evelyn understood that emotion was a luxury she could not afford. Richard wasn't simply cheating. He was constructing a narrative designed to ruin her reputation, seize her controlling shares, and possibly eliminate her entirely. That required planning, which meant it could be dismantled. She began with silence. Instead of questioning the late nights, she encouraged them. I know expansion into Atlanta is stressful, she told him gently one evening. I'm proud of you. Richard's shoulders relaxed. Suspicion thrives under pressure. Confidence grows in comfort. Evelyn gave him comfort. Meanwhile, she contacted Marcus Reed, her attorney since her father's passing. Marcus was discreet, relentless, and loyal. They met not in her office, but in a private conference room at a Black-owned hotel downtown, neutral territory. Evelyn brought the recorder. She watched Marcus's expression darken as Richard's voice filled the room. This isn't just marital misconduct, Marcus said quietly. This is conspiracy, fraud, premeditation, and possibly attempted murder, Evelyn replied evenly. They began mapping defensive layers. First, her shares. Though she held majority ownership, Richard had operational signing authority in several subsidiaries. Marcus worked with a corporate restructuring specialist to quietly transfer her controlling interest into an irrevocable trust with protective provisions that required dual independent oversight for any liquidation or conversion. Richard would no longer be able to trigger automatic transfers without exposing himself. Second, a forensic audit. Evelyn commissioned it under the pretense of routine expansion compliance. A trusted black CPA firm began combing through internal logs, metadata, access timestamps. Within days, anomalies surfaced. Login attempts under Evelyn's credentials at odd hours, draft wire transfers to shell corporations not yet executed, staged internal memos implying financial negligence. Richard wasn't improvising. He was building a paper trail. Evelyn felt the chill of realization. He planned to accuse her before she could accuse him. At home, she sharpened her listening. The recorder returned to the car again and again. Each playback revealed more carelessness. The mistress, Monique, had grown bolder. She asked about timelines. About after everything settles. About public perception. Richard reassured her with a confidence that would have impressed Evelyn if it weren't aimed at her destruction. "She won't see it coming," he said one evening, engine idling. "By the time the board reviews the discrepancies, I'll look like the one trying to save the company." Evelyn paused the recording and closed her eyes briefly. He intended to weaponize her own excellence against her. She had built Hart Global into a respected institution within black business circles, a symbol of generational wealth done right. A scandal tied to fraud would not just strip her position, it would stain her father's legacy. That thought burned hotter than betrayal. So she escalated. Without alerting Richard, she spoke privately with the company's chief technology officer, a longtime family friend. Framed as a cybersecurity strengthening initiative, she authorized silent monitoring flags for administrative-level data movement. Any attempt to alter foundational ownership documents would now trigger an internal alert routed only to her and the CTO. 2 nights later, the alert came. Richard had accessed archived formation documents for one of their largest holding companies at 11:47 p.m. He didn't complete any edits. He was studying the structure. Preparing. Evelyn did nothing. That was the part that unnerved even Marcus. "You're letting him continue?" he asked. "Yes," she replied calmly. "I want him confident. The more complete his plan, the clearer his intent." There was another discovery, one that made her hands tremble despite her control. During a routine review of personal policies tied to executive benefits, her financial advisor noticed a recent update. Richard had increased a life insurance policy payout substantially. He had also ensured he was sole beneficiary. The timing aligned precisely with the restructuring documents he'd been drafting. When Evelyn confronted the advisor casually, "Did we both approve this?" The answer was no. Richard had handled it independently. That night, she lay beside him in their king-sized bed, listening to his steady breathing. The man who once held her like she was sacred now slept with lethal ambition in his pocket. She studied the ceiling in the darkness and accepted a truth that steadied her resolve. Love had left the room long before she discovered the recorder. In the following weeks, she became almost radiant. She suggested a weekend getaway. She toasted to their next chapter. She mentioned feeling overwhelmed and joked about letting you take the reins one day. Each statement was bait wrapped in vulnerability. Richard absorbed it greedily. Monique's tone on the recordings shifted from cautious to celebratory. "So when?" she pressed one evening. "Soon," Richard replied. "She's practically stepping aside on her own." Evelyn smiled faintly as she listened. Good. Let him believe she was surrendering. Behind the scenes, Marcus prepared contingency filings. Draft divorce papers citing financial misconduct. Criminal referral packets organized but not yet submitted. Documentation indexed with timestamps that aligned perfectly with the recordings. If Richard moved first, they would respond within hours. The war had begun, but it was invisible. At the next executive briefing, Richard presented concerns about minor inconsistencies in projected reports, planting seeds of doubt about oversight without directly accusing her. Evelyn watched the board members exchange subtle glances. She feigned surprise, even concern. "If there's any question," she said smoothly, "we should bring in an independent investigator. Transparency protects us all." Richard agreed too quickly. He thought it was his idea taking root. He didn't know the investigator had already been hired. And as Evelyn left the conference room that afternoon, heels clicking against marble floors, she understood something with crystal clarity. Richard believed he was several moves ahead. But he was playing checkers. She was playing chess. By the time Richard believed he was winning, Evelyn had already calculated the endgame. The shift from defense to offense was subtle. She didn't attack, she suggested. She didn't accuse, she confided. Over candlelit dinners and carefully curated vulnerability, she began planting ideas designed to accelerate his greed. "I've been thinking," she told him one evening, swirling wine in her glass, her tone thoughtful. "Maybe I've been holding on too tightly. Maybe it's time to restructure things, make transitions smoother long-term." Richard looked up too quickly. "Transitions? For the company," she clarified softly. "You've handled operations so well. I've been exhausted lately. Maybe we should revisit ownership alignment. Simplify it." He masked his interest with concern. "We don't have to rush anything." But his eyes betrayed him. That night, the recorder captured excitement in Monique's voice. "She said that? On her own?" "Yes," Richard replied, barely containing satisfaction. "She thinks it's her idea." Evelyn replayed that clip 3 times. Confirmation. He was emotionally invested now. Overconfidence was blooming. So she fed it. She began leaving folders slightly visible in her home office. Draft summaries of potential holding restructures. They were real documents, but incomplete. Designed to suggest vulnerability without granting control. She casually mentioned upcoming travel that would limit her oversight for a few days. She scheduled back-to-back public appearances to reinforce the narrative that she was distracted. Meanwhile, the independent investigator, David Lawson, a former federal financial crimes analyst, quietly dug deeper. Evelyn had introduced him to the board as a proactive compliance safeguard. Richard welcomed him, even volunteered cooperation. That was the mistake, because David didn't just review numbers. He tracked behavior, login patterns, metadata trails, deleted drafts. Richard had been careful, but not careful enough. Files planted to implicate Evelyn were created on devices that had previously accessed Monique's private consulting firm network. Payments to that same consulting firm had been approved under discretionary operational budgets Richard controlled. The noose was tightening, fiber by fiber. Then came the pivotal moment. One afternoon, Evelyn intentionally signed a preliminary authorization form Richard had been subtly pushing for weeks. It granted exploratory authority for a structural review. Nothing binding, nothing irreversible, but it looked significant. She placed the signed copy on his desk herself. "I trust you," she said quietly. The words nearly made him flinch. That evening, the recorder captured pure carelessness. "It's happening," Richard told Monique. She signed off. "Once I finalize the internal audit concerns, the board will demand temporary removal while everything gets investigated. During that window, I'll initiate the conversion." "And if she fights it?" Monique asked. "She won't have leverage. The fraud trail points to her." "I made sure of that." Evelyn's jaw tightened as she listened. Made sure of that. He truly believed he had insulated himself. What he didn't know was that IT had already mirrored the company server. Every keystroke, every draft, every remote login was archived externally. The fraud trail he constructed carried his digital fingerprints layered beneath the surface. Timestamps mismatched with Evelyn's physical locations, IP addresses tied to his private devices, even voice-activated logins captured through system security logs. Evelyn had allowed him to build evidence. Now she began guiding him toward exposure. At the next board meeting, Richard presented his concerns formally. His tone was measured, regretful. "There appear to be discrepancies tied to executive-level oversight," he said carefully, glancing at Evelyn with practiced reluctance. "I didn't want to believe it, but fiduciary responsibility requires transparency." Board members shifted uncomfortably. Hart Global wasn't just profitable, it was symbolic. A Black-owned powerhouse navigating elite financial spaces with precision. The mere suggestion of executive misconduct threatened reputational damage. Evelyn didn't react defensively. She leaned forward calmly. "If there's even a question of irregularity tied to my office," she said, voice steady, "I welcome full independent review. I suggest we authorize Mr. Lawson to conduct a complete forensic analysis, access to everything, including executive operational accounts." A flicker crossed Richard's face. Too fast for most to notice. But Evelyn saw it. He had expected hesitation, resistance, perhaps emotional outrage. Instead, she offered expansion. Unrestricted access meant his own movements would be examined with equal intensity. He had boxed himself in. Still, he nodded. "Of course. Transparency protects us all." That phrase echoed later in his car. "You think he suspects anything?" Monique asked. "No," Richard said firmly. "She's too proud to think I'd ever move against her. She believes in loyalty." Evelyn stopped the recording and let out a slow breath. He was right about one thing. She did believe in loyalty, which is why betrayal had consequences. Days later, another alert triggered. Richard attempted to fast-track internal documentation citing temporary executive suspension pending review. He hadn't submitted it yet. He was testing language. Preparing. Evelyn forwarded the draft silently to Marcus and David. The trap was no longer theoretical. It was operational, and Richard was stepping exactly where she wanted him to. By the end of the week, whispers had begun circulating among senior leadership. Not accusations, just tension. Richard's subtle campaigning was working. He positioned himself as the concerned protector of the company's integrity. What he didn't realize was that several board members had already been privately briefed by Evelyn months earlier about governance strengthening measures. They trusted her instincts. They had watched her build the company from inherited capital into a national force. Doubt did not come easily, but proof would. And proof was almost ready. That night, Evelyn stood alone in her office overlooking the city skyline. The lights shimmered below like quiet witnesses. She thought about her father again, how he taught her that power isn't loud, it's patient. Richard believed he was orchestrating her fall. In reality, she was conducting his confession. All he had to do now was finish what he started. The morning of the board meeting arrived heavy with anticipation. Evelyn dressed with deliberate precision, a tailored ivory suit, understated but commanding. Her hair was sleek, her makeup minimal, her expression composed. She did not look like a woman under suspicion. She looked like a CEO walking into another strategic review. Richard, on the other hand, wore navy, power blue tie, controlled confidence. He even held the door for her as they entered Hart Global's executive floor together, the picture of unity. To an outsider, they were still the formidable black power couple that business magazines admired. But war was quiet, and today it would be public. Inside the boardroom sat 12 individuals who had helped shape the company's rise. Investors, legal advisors, longtime allies of Evelyn's father. At the far end of the polished mahogany table sat David Lawson, the independent investigator. Calm, methodical. A thick binder rested in front of him. Richard began. He spoke with restraint, as though burdened by responsibility. The purpose of today's session is to review findings from the independent audit regarding potential executive-level financial irregularities. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. Evelyn remained still, hands folded neatly on the table. David opened the binder. "What we uncovered," he began evenly, "was not what we initially expected." Richard's jaw tightened slightly. David continued. "At first glance, there appeared to be a pattern suggesting misallocated funds tied to executive authorization codes associated with Mrs. Hart." Silence deepened. Richard lowered his gaze, performing reluctance. "But forensic metadata analysis tells a more complete story," David added. He pressed a remote. The screen behind him illuminated with timestamps, IP logs, and digital authentication records. "The transactions in question were drafted under Mrs. Hart's credentials," David said. "However, they originated from devices registered to Mr. Richard Hart's operational network. Additionally, Biometric access records show Mrs. Hart was physically present at 3 separate public events during the timestamps of these internal logins. A murmur rippled across the table. Richard straightened. That's impossible. Credentials can be spoofed. They can, David agreed calmly, which is why we traced device layer encryption signatures. The originating hardware serial numbers correspond to Mr. Hart's private executive laptop and secondary mobile device. The room shifted. Evelyn did not move. David changed slides. Furthermore, draft internal memorandums alleging executive negligence were created, edited, and saved under temporary files connected to Mr. Hart's administrator clearance. Richard leaned forward. This is circumstantial. It is layered, David interrupted gently. And it continues. Another slide appeared. Insurance documentation. Policy increase. Sole beneficiary, Richard Hart. Effective date, 2 weeks after the first falsified financial draft. The air thinned. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice calm but resonant. Would you explain the timing of that update, Richard? He looked at her then, not as a husband, but as an exposed man. That was standard estate planning, he said quickly. We discussed long-term protection. Evelyn held his gaze. We did not. David cleared his throat softly. There's more. And then came the final blow. David pressed play. The boardroom filled with the unmistakable sound of Richard's voice inside his car. Once she signs off on the restructuring, it's done. The shares automatically convert. The room froze. Monique's voice followed, crisp and unmistakable. And if she doesn't? Richard's recorded reply echoed against the walls. She won't have a choice. By then, the financial discrepancies will point straight to her. A sharp intake of breath came from one of the senior board members. The recording continued. Once she's out of the way, everything transfers to me. The words hung there. Heavy. Final. Evelyn watched Richard's composure collapse in real time. The confidence drained first. Then the color. Then the posture. He looked around the table as though searching for an ally. But loyalty dissolves quickly in the presence of evidence. You recorded me? He demanded, his voice cracking between anger and disbelief. Evelyn met his fury with stillness. I protected myself. Richard turned to the board. This is manipulation. She's twisting. Mr. Hart, the board chairman interrupted sharply, his tone no longer cordial. Did you or did you not make these statements? Richard hesitated. That hesitation was louder than confession. Security was called not because of violence, but because governance demanded containment. Corporate bylaws allowed immediate suspension pending criminal referral when executive misconduct threatened shareholder stability. 2 uniformed officers entered quietly. The humiliation was absolute. Richard stood slowly, eyes burning, not with remorse, but with the realization that he had been outplayed. As he passed Evelyn, he leaned close enough for only her to hear. You planned this. She turned her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. No, you did. He was escorted out of the room he once believed he would control. The door closed. Silence remained. David gathered his documents. Full forensic documentation has been duplicated for legal authorities. Based on findings, this meets the threshold for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted financial coercion. One board member, an elder who had known Evelyn's father for decades, looked at her with both sorrow and pride. You handled this with remarkable restraint. Evelyn inhaled slowly. Restraint had cost her sleep. Trust. Love. But it had preserved her legacy. Outside the building, news had not yet broken, but it would. Arrests of high-level executives never stayed quiet, especially not within the Black business community, where representation at that level carried symbolic weight. There would be headlines, speculation, scrutiny. Evelyn was prepared. Before the meeting adjourned, she addressed the board. Transparency will be our shield, she said firmly. We release a statement acknowledging internal misconduct discovered through proactive compliance review. We reaffirm leadership stability. We protect our employees and shareholders. Her voice did not tremble. This was no longer about marriage. It was about stewardship. As executives filed out, the chairman paused beside her. "Are you all right, Evelyn?" She considered the question carefully. "No," she answered honestly. "But I will be." Later that evening, as city lights flickered on beyond her office windows, Evelyn stood alone where Richard had once imagined standing in triumph. The empire was still intact. The damage he planned had ricocheted back onto him. Monique, under pressure, would cooperate within days. Charges would follow. Civil suits would protect company assets. The trust Marcus established ensured her controlling interest was untouchable. Richard had attempted to erase her. Instead, he had documented his own undoing. Evelyn looked out over the skyline her father once told her she belonged in. Victory did not feel loud. It felt steady. And though betrayal had cut deep, it had not destroyed her. It had revealed her. Strategic. Patient. Unbreakable. The reckoning had come. And she was still standing. The headlines broke 3 days later. Hart Global Executive under investigation for fraud conspiracy. Internal audit exposes financial misconduct. The media cycle moved fast, but Evelyn moved faster. Before speculation could distort the narrative, Hart Global released a controlled, carefully worded statement. The irregularities were uncovered during a proactive compliance review initiated by CEO Evelyn Hart. The company remained financially strong. Leadership continuity was secure. No mention of marriage. No emotional undertones. Just facts. The market responded with brief uncertainty, but not collapse. Investors trusted stability. And Evelyn had become synonymous with stability. Richard, meanwhile, was formally charged with financial fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate theft, and attempted coercive restructuring. The life insurance adjustment triggered additional investigative scrutiny. Under pressure, Monique accepted a deal in exchange for testimony and documentation of private communications. It was over legally before it was over emotionally. Evelyn filed for divorce the same week the criminal case became public. There were no dramatic courtroom confrontations. No shouting matches. Just paperwork, sealed settlements, and the cold dismantling of a union that had once been celebrated as aspirational Black excellence. She did not attend Richard's preliminary hearing. She did not need to. Her presence was no longer required for consequences to unfold. Instead, she redirected her energy. First, she fortified the company. Governance protocols were strengthened. Dual authentication requirements were expanded. Independent oversight committees were established. She promoted 2 senior Black women into executive leadership roles, brilliant, seasoned professionals who had quietly helped sustain operations during the chaos. Legacy means nothing if it isn't protected, she told them during their first strategy session. We're building systems that outlive personalities. The board approved unanimously. Next, she launched something deeply personal, the Hart Initiative for Financial Integrity and Protection, a foundation dedicated to supporting women, particularly Black women, facing financial abuse, corporate manipulation, and coercive control within marriages or partnerships. She didn't announce the foundation with fanfare. She funded it, quietly at first. Legal aid grants, financial literacy programs, emergency transition resources. Because Evelyn understood something now in a way she never had before. Betrayal inside boardrooms is devastating. Betrayal inside a marriage is suffocating. And too many women lack the resources to fight back strategically. The foundation became her reclamation. Months passed. The criminal case concluded with a plea agreement. Richard accepted reduced sentencing in exchange for restitution and full admission of wrongdoing. His professional reputation disintegrated completely. Invitations vanished. Partnerships dissolved. The empire he once believed he would control became a place his name could no longer enter. Evelyn never spoke publicly about him. When asked in interviews how she navigated recent challenges, she answered with grace. Integrity always reveals itself, eventually. At home, the silence felt different now. Not heavy, clear. She redesigned the house, removed photographs that no longer reflected truth, donated furniture chosen jointly, reclaimed spaces that had once felt shared. One evening, alone in her study, she opened the small recorder for the last time. She pressed play, not to relive pain, but to measure distance. Richard's voice filled the room again. Once she's out of the way. She stopped it halfway through the sentence. There was no anger left in her chest. Only clarity. He had underestimated her because he believed love weakened her. He had mistaken kindness for blindness. He had assumed power belonged to whoever seized it fastest. But power, she now understood fully, belongs to whoever understands the board. And she had always understood the board. She deleted the recordings. Not because she needed to forget, but because she no longer needed proof. A year later, Hart Global reported record profits. The foundation expanded nationally. At an industry conference celebrating Black entrepreneurship, Evelyn stood at a podium beneath bright lights. She spoke about governance, foresight, and protecting generational wealth. She did not speak about betrayal. She did not speak about survival. But those who listened closely heard it between the lines. After the applause faded and the ballroom emptied, she stood alone near the window overlooking the city skyline. The same skyline she had once stared at on the night before the reckoning. The difference now was not victory. It was peace. She had entered the storm as a wife fighting to protect what she built. She emerged as something sharper. Not hardened, refined. The game had been ruthless. But she had learned its rules faster than her opponent. And in the end, she didn't just win. She transformed the battlefield. Evelyn Hart had not merely survived betrayal. She had converted it into legacy. The queen had never been cornered. She had been calculating her final move. Finally, we have come to the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more intriguing stories.